Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Basil Smikle. I'm the director of the public policy program here at Roosevelt House Institute. I want to acknowledge and thank President Rabb for her leadership, Howard Holzer, who is the director of this institute. Also thank our staff, Peter, Bianca, Alexis, Phil, Aaron, Magda, and Danny, who are all part of setting up and putting this together for us today. We have a very simple format. We are going to have a bit of a conversation up front here, and after about 30 minutes or so, I'm happy to take questions from our audience. And we do have some folks who are tuning in via Zoom as well. So we have an opportunity to hear and get some questions from the folks who are on Zoom as well. So we look forward to that. If you have any interest, and we encourage you to do so, to look at the Roosevelt House website, you can find us at roosevelthouse.hunter.cuny.edu for more information on what we do here at the Institute and any upcoming events. So thank you for joining us today, which is the second such brown bag event for this Institute. And today we're going to be talking with some experts on the issue of voter suppression and ballot access. And I just want to say, I called your name just a few minutes ago, Harold. Harold Holzer, the director of this institute. Thank you for coming, sir. As we're talking about protecting the ballot, election law, and voter access today, I am pleased to welcome two of our wonderful guests, Dr. Sandy Schramm, who's a political scientist and here in the Department of Political Science at Hunter College, and is a faculty associate here at Roosevelt House. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor. And Jerry Goldfeder, who's a special advisor to the American Bar Association's Election Law Committee and special counsel at Strzok and Levan. Is it Levan or Levan? Levan, LLP. And just as a personal note, Jerry, you may remember this. I first met you, I think it's 25 years ago this year, at the Eleanor Roosevelt Democratic Club, and we were introduced by Carol Rinsler. So Jerry and I go back a ways. And
I would love to say I remember exactly.
I know you don't. I think I have a signed picture of that moment hanging on my wall somewhere. So, but thank you, it's wonderful. We've been in touch and worked together many times since then, so it's good to see you here, and thank you so much for coming. Everybody has a mic, so I'm going to throw out the first question to both of you in your work, in your line of work, and in your expertise. I'll start with Jerry. How do we define voter suppression and ballot access? Are they different? If not, or if so, how are they connected?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's good to be with you, and it's good to be with all of you today. This is a very, very critical subject for the future of our republic. There is a wave of voter suppression laws that are being enacted since the 2020 election. These laws, many of these laws have been enacted before that as well, but they've ramped up to try to stop people from voting, not just any people, but let's be specific, Republican legislatures, and I'm not making a partisan statement, even though it might sound that way. I'm making an observation as to actually what's occurring. Many Republican legislatures are enacting laws to make it difficult for those who tend to vote Democratic to be able to vote. And they're doing it by cutting back early voting, by making it difficult to vote by mail, by requiring certain IDs, proof of who they are, which is sometimes very difficult to obtain. In other words, a whole panoply of laws are being put into place in order to suppress Democratic votes because Republicans feel that's the only way they could win state elections and federal elections. That's in addition to that, I hate to tell you, but we're also having a wave of what we call election subversion laws, which is slightly different. The first set of laws relate to stopping people from voting, making it difficult for people to vote. The second set of laws, what we call election subversion, is putting into place partisan actors rather than objective, lifelong election regulators, election administrators, partisan actors to change the results, to taint the results, to modify the results of what actually occurs in a particular county or state. So what we are witnessing, again, especially since 2020, but before that as well, is a real attack on our electoral system. How's that for an introduction to
right.
where we are today? It's very serious, and we need to talk about solutions here. But
So, Professor, I'd ask you the same question. How do you define voter suppression, ballot access? And to Jerry's point, this has been going on for some time. So if there's some historical context you can give us as well.
No, thanks for having me, Basil. It's great to be here and discuss this important topic. And I think Jerry got right to the point. And, you know, historically, you know, the ballot has been limited in the United States. A lot of people couldn't vote for a long time. And even after the end of slavery, under Jim Crow, as late as 1965, less than 3% of all African Americans in Mississippi could vote, right? So it's relatively recent that we've made strides towards a multiracial democracy. And I think what's happening in the country, and Trumpism is, I think, the primary case in point, is that a lot of white people have doubts about whether they want that. And they're saying, if democracy means multiracial democracy, I'm not interested in it. And I'm willing to rewrite the laws to undermine majority rule or allow the people to determine who their elected officials are through fair and open elections. And you know, the attempt to keep the black vote down has been going on for a long time, using the myth of voter fraud, and now it's extended to just all outgroups that are seen as threatening to the white majority in the Republican Party. And you know, I agree, it's a very fraught moment for the Republic, and whether we're going to maintain the rule of law, have a liberal democracy where there's popular sovereignty, and we can make strides towards a multiracial democracy. You know, one of the things that I thought is really interesting that I heard recently was from Mark Elias, the election lawyer who's working on these cases. He's saying that a lot of these laws in these states are actually designed to manufacture election fraud where none exists by making it too complicated, so that then it creates a pretense to say that the election was tainted and the legislature ought to be authorized to override it. And so I think it's rather nefarious what's going on, and we need to be very much vigilant in staying on top of it.
Now, I'm sorry, and in addition to what both of you have said, the argument, if I were to play devil's advocate, right, and I hate to do it in this situation, but because we're at Hunter College and we want to make sure that we're understanding the arguments and how powerful they can be, there is an argument that says, well, what's the problem with making sure that people have the right ID, that they show up and can identify themselves when they go vote? Why is that a problem? How does that fit into the historic sort of suppression of the vote?
Well, it depends on what kind of ID you need. If a poor African American who was born in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and moves to a non-southern state, to Texas, to Missouri, to Indiana, and they're required to show a birth certificate in order to be able to vote, and they don't have access to a birth certificate because they moved from their home state quite a while ago. There are procedures by which they can get it, but it costs money. And there are administrative hurdles that are in place in every state in order to get a duplicate birth certificate. So you get the idea. It's not just having an ID. By the way, if the United States government gave out IDs to everyone, just like everyone, or mostly everyone, has Social Security cards, then there wouldn't be a problem. Everyone would have that ID, they'd have it readily, they'd have it for free, and people would show their ID just like they have to show their ID when they go on a plane. That's their argument. But it doesn't work that easily. And because of that, there are certain groups, just as a generalization, there are certain groups of people, through no fault of their own, have a difficult time getting the ID that is required in some states. Not all states require an ID, just certain states. And it's keyed to particular groups who vote in a particular way. So that's the problem. As an abstraction, well, there's nothing wrong with that. You needed to get on a plane. You now need to show your vaccination card to go anywhere. And so, as an abstraction, it's fine. But the reality and the implementation of it works against certain kinds of people who vote in a particular kind of way. And that's the problem.
Now, we have, and we've been hearing, and I was talking about this yesterday, in Texas, Senate Bill 1, SB 1, proposed to strip access to voting gained during the pandemic that made voting easier for historically disenfranchised voters. Now, we have all experienced certainly here in New York, we've been able to vote in ways that we had not prior. And I guess from this Texas bill, they're looking to pull all of that back. So if you can talk, either of you, both of you, talk about this Texas bill, how pernicious it is, what they're proposing.
Right, well, the Texas bill is a little bit of a moving target as they've made revisions, but what Jerry was talking about, voter suppression on the one hand and voter access on the other hand, I think are really at the forefront here in the Texas bill. What's really troublesome is the Texas model is being replicated in other states where they're saying that if there's fraud or something wrong with the election, we authorize the state legislature, controlled by the Republicans, to determine the outcome and override and invalidate the popular vote. And that is really, I think, a very aggressive act based on a misinterpretation of the U.S. Constitution and based on a pretense that there's massive voter fraud. And if they're writing the laws in ways that help manufacture this pretense by saying, oh, if you make it so confusing that people make mistakes, then they can exploit that as an example of voter fraud. And Jerry's absolutely right. I mean, Al Gore thinks, the government should register everyone. And Bernie Sanders thinks that Election Day should be a national holiday. I mean, if we really are committed to achieving a multiracial democracy, we'd be making it easier for everybody to vote who's entitled to vote. And we can do this right away. States like Oregon have made great strides in this regard of registering everybody, giving people time off to vote, using mail-in balloting, which is safe and not, like Trump claims, an opportunity for massive fraud. So if we were really serious about achieving a multiracial, inclusive democracy, we could take these elementary steps and we would have election integrity without fraud and popular sovereignty. But instead, it's really silly to play along with the Republican claim that there's voter fraud and the election was stolen. I thought Lynn Cheney last night, when the select committee that's investigating January 6th said that they want to hold Steve Bannon in contempt for refusing to testify, she was very eloquent in saying, look, Republicans know the election was not stolen. There was not enough fraud in any credible amount that would determine or change the outcome. We know that this is all a big lie, and we need to have the fortitude to stand up and call it out, because it's simply out of control.
So, so let me just add to what you're saying. I'll give you some specifics about Texas and also about Georgia. So Texas in 2020, like every state, has a decentralized voting system. If you noticed, New York votes in a different way than Oregon, than Texas, than Illinois. And that was designed by the founders, that states regulate their own elections. Well, that's true for local elections, state elections, and also for federal elections. And within a state, counties have pretty much a lot of their own authority and power to regulate their own elections. They're true that there are state laws, but there's a lot of discretion by various county officials. And sometimes that's a good thing. So, for example, in Texas, during the pandemic, during the 2020 election, the folks who ran Harris County, the Harris County election effort, decided that they would innovate and make it easier for people to vote by having drive-by voting and more drop boxes for mailing, people who mailed in their ballots to put in drop boxes and so on. One of the features, and it worked very well. Republicans went to court to stop it. They didn't succeed. But what the legislature is now attempting to do, and I think successfully, you're right, it's a moving target. They keep changing the bill in Texas. But what a fundamental piece of the Texas legislation is that county officials shouldn't have that discretion to innovate, to make it easier for people to vote. In Georgia, the new law, aside from the fact that you can't give water or food to people waiting on these long lines, which of course is ridiculous, and everybody is focused in on that, the more pernicious aspect to the Georgia law is that as a result of the partisan effort in the legislature, the Secretary of State, Raffensperger, has been stripped of his authority to participate in election regulation. Well, obviously, they did that because they didn't like how he responded to Trump's urging for him to find 11,000 votes. But more fundamental, the election regulators now can remove county election regulators in up to 4 counties. So what does that mean? It means if the legislature doesn't like what the county election regulators are doing, they can be removed and have someone else put in their place. Well, one of the counties is Fulton County. And Fulton County includes Atlanta, a huge Democratic vote in the state of Georgia. As a result of this new law in Georgia, the person who runs Fulton County elections, just a normal person trying to run elections, can be removed if the partisan legislature doesn't like what they are doing, because the outcome is not going to be to the benefit of the Republican Party. This is outrageous. It means that there is real interference. Not only are we suppressing the vote by making it difficult for certain people to be able to vote, but we're interfering with election regulators who are just trying to do their job. Some of them are Republicans, some of them are Democrats, but as we all know from our experience, when we go to vote, most of these people, overwhelmingly, 99% of them, if not 100% of them, are just trying to get through the day to make it so that you can vote, and they fill out everything correctly and so on. That's really why they do it. These people are just actually very civic-minded people who get paid bupkis in order to do their work for many, many hours, and they're being interfered with. As a matter of fact, it's not just Georgia, but a few other states are criminalizing certain ordinary conduct by these election regulators in order to make certain that they don't do their job the way they're supposed to. And as a result of that, a lot of election poll workers and so on are just quitting their jobs, and election regulators from various states are just quitting their jobs, which of course means that more partisan people will be involved in election regulation. So I wanted to give you some little details of what's happening in Texas and in Georgia and throughout the country, because it's really very pernicious as to what they're doing. And they are, my final point on this is they're using the law to do it. In other words, it's legal. Unless challenged and found unconstitutional, which is difficult to do, it's legal. And think about that. Using the law to strip people of voting, using the law to change the electoral process. We would not be the first country to use the law to undermine liberal democracy. That's what we're facing.
And I want to come back to that point, but I first want to say that we should also acknowledge that we have to talk about redistricting in this context as well, right? Because Texas is redistricting right now. From what I understand in my research, they're gaining 2 congressional seats, if I remember correctly, because they've gained significant population since the last census. And in their designing of the districts, not one district, based on their new their proposal, has a majority-minority population, though over almost 90% of the people who've moved to Texas in the last 2 years are people of color. So that also sort of factors into the equation, which is pretty significant. So we also have to talk about redistricting and political power in DC as a result of that.
One little point. Sorry, I'll just make one little point. I'll make 2 little points about redistricting, which is to say the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled that partisanship as a factor when state legislators or independent commissions redraw the lines for state legislatures and for Congress, partisanship can be used. It's not unconstitutional for a state to try to get more Democrats or more Republicans in office. That's number one. The second is a rhetorical question, which is, we are in New York, we are redistricting as well. Every state does it every 10 years. And there is an effort among the Democrats, I don't know about you, but he and I are Democrats. There's an effort by the Democrats to, even though we lost 1 congressional seat, to gain more Democratic members of Congress through the redistricting effort so that we can hold on to the House of Representatives. The rhetorical question is, should we say, well, the Republicans shouldn't do that, but the Democrats can do that? Or should we step back and say, partisanship should not be involved by either party? That's a rhetorical question, but it's a critical political question as we move forward on this.
Now, Professor, what's the role of the federal government in this? Can the federal government, you talked about the judiciary, but can the Justice Department, can the federal government actually intervene in what's happening in Texas or in any other part of the country? What are the powers that the federal government has to do this or not do this? And then, if so, and maybe this is a question for you as well, where then does the burden lie? Does the burden lie on the black voter, the black household, or the individual more so, to take these matters to court to get justice?
My understanding is that the Texas redistricting
Use the
plan is.
microphones.
My understanding is that the Texas redistricting plan has just gone to court. So especially the Latino community is rising up to try and contest this. So you're absolutely right that it's more than just changing the election laws and trying to suppress the vote or shift power to the legislature to override the vote. It's also stuffing the judiciary with all of these judges that are willing to go along with all of this stuff. And the Supreme Court now is allowing for partisan gerrymandering as a legitimate thing that sort of obligates the Democrats to have to participate in that until it changes. And so it's all legal, like Jerry's saying, and that's making it very difficult to contest this. We have to elect different members of Congress. We have to get different judges in there. We have to pass different laws. The federal government's power is at stake here. It can still be used to some extent. I mean, I think the Senate is going to vote today on the Freedom to Vote Act. I don't know what the status of that is, given how the Senate is tied up in the filibuster, and you need 60 votes to be able to get anything done outside of the budgetary process. And so it's a slog. It's a very difficult situation. But I think, if amazingly the Democratic Party were to be able to do well, rather than, as it's projected, to lose control in the upcoming midterm elections, and they were able to then exercise some federal power, they could pass laws that make Election Day a holiday, to require everyone to be registered by the government so that we have both election integrity and access to the ballot. We could do a lot of things. It's still possible. But for over 30 years, right, the conservatives in this country have been undermining the idea of popular sovereignty, and they've made huge inroads in acquiring power to do that, and it's not going to be done away with overnight.
And do those inroads, they go beyond the ballot box as well? I imagine they go beyond election reform. When I think about post, from a historical context, when I think about post-Brown and the sort of fight against integration and the sort of creation of political constituencies to sort of be separate and apart from, interestingly enough, separate and apart from sort of urban areas, or urban school districts, and how, and the contributions to white flight that caused. It seems to me that there is that oftentimes there are, and you talked about the legality of all of this, that there are folks who are intent upon using the law to continuously create this sort of marginalization and disenfranchisement. And I guess what you're saying therefore is that it's not just about fighting this specific bill, it's about really affecting an entire system that is sort of working against disadvantaged groups, minority populations. How pervasive is that? I mean, that's...
Well, yeah, I think if you take a historical perspective and you look at it, is that one social movement has countered another. So the civil rights movement allowed for racial progress and racial inclusion. And we got to the point when Obama was running the first time for the presidency, the African-American vote turnout rate was higher than it was for whites, right? And it was critical in his election. And I think that intensified the reluctance of some whites to support the civil rights movement, the Tea Party rising up, and eventually you're getting Trump coming forward. And there's a anti-civil rights movement that has emerged that's pushing back against this. And over time, by appointing judges, by passing laws, by claiming voter fraud, there's been a lot of backsliding that has occurred. Now, I think recently we see that this is being countered, especially in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, which were very multiracial and overwhelmingly peaceful, contrary to what some people want to emphasize on Fox News. We're starting to see other people are saying, no, we don't want to backslide. And so our politics have become intensely racialized, and the parties are reflecting this. The Republican Party is overwhelmingly a white party seeking to undermine multiracial democracy. And the Democratic Party is more diverse and in ways that we've not really experienced before. It's very intense. And this racialization of our partisan politics, and we're going to have to work through it.
And so, Jerry, you talked about New York specifically before. How do our voter access laws sort of measure up to the rest of the country?
So we have an election coming up in. So we have an election coming up in 2 weeks, and on the ballot there are 5 questions to amend the Constitution of the state of New York. One of them will embed in the Constitution the ability to vote by mail without having to demonstrate an excuse. So this is 2021, and New York is finally adopting a constitutional amendment so that people don't have to say, oh, I'm sick, or I'm out of the county, or whatever other kinds of reasons they might have in order to vote by mail. We are finally catching up to having what we call no excuse mail-in ballots. We were, I believe, if I recall correctly, the 43rd state to have early voting. Now we have it. Also on the ballot is a proposal, a proposed New York State constitutional amendment for what we call same-day registration, which many other states have. You decide at the last minute you want to vote. Well, in New York, you have to be registered for presently at least 10 days before the election is what the Constitution says, but the statute says a greater period of time. So now we're about to change that if people vote for it, so people can decide, well, I want to vote, and I'm going to register on that day. So New York has really been not the empire state when it comes to voting opportunities for people, but we're making up for it, slowly but surely. We also now have automatic registration ability that is being put into place, started by Oregon, as a matter of fact, a number of years ago. So there's a lot more that can be done, even in New York. But as difficult as it has been in New York to be able to vote, what the worst part of our procedures here in New York is that we have a Board of Elections.
That was my next question, because
Okay.
we hear a lot about boards of elections in New York and across the country. Where do they fit into all of this? How are they even selected?
Every state has their own way of running their elections. Again, it goes back to the United States Constitution. Article 1, Section 4, states shall regulate their own elections. Congress can supersede that, but it rarely does that. So we regulate our own elections. And as a reform, many years ago, we instituted a bipartisan Board of Elections. Bipartisan meaning it's almost every official at the Board of Elections doing almost every kind of work. It has to be one Democrat and one Republican. So that's a little wasteful, but it was meant to take partisanship out of the Board of Elections. Instead, the way it's developed is that we have total partisanship. Generally speaking, the Republicans take care of the needs of the Democrats, and the Democrats take care of the needs of the Republicans. And both parties run the Board of Elections in ways that, shall we say, can be improved. We really ought to have a professionalized, nonpartisan election regulation system like they do in some states. Not every state is progressive in this respect, but there are enough states to give us a model to, for us to reform the way we conduct our elections. And we all experience, we all read the news, and we know that from time to time, 100-some-odd thousand voters are being purged in Brooklyn because somebody made a mistake, or the wrong numbers were given out in the ranked choice voting that we had last year. The training could be better, but the population of the Board of Elections should be different. It wouldn't be such a bad idea to have some kind of civil service exam, as we do in other areas, for a professionalized Board of Elections. But again, who would make that change? The only people who could make that change in the first instance is the legislature. And legislatures, like every legislature, is partisan. So the Democrats and Republicans in the legislature are not about to reform the way we conduct elections, because they're incumbents and it works for them. And the only way that's going to change is the only way all of these laws are going to change, not through litigation. And I'm an election lawyer and I get involved in litigation all the time. Litigation is not going to solve the problem. The only real antidote to the voter restriction laws that we're having and the subversion laws that are being passed and the way we run elections, even here in New York, is popular movement. That's the only thing that's going to engender the kind of support and persuade elected officials to make those kinds of changes. The last point I'll make on this, since we're in the Roosevelt House, one of the presidents who admired and emulated Roosevelt, of course, was Lyndon Johnson. And if you can, for a half a second, put aside the Vietnam War, just put it aside for a second. Lyndon Johnson gave us the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act '65, Medicare. So he was a great president. He, like Roosevelt, knew how to work the levers of power in order to get real change for the people of the country. But the reason he was able to do it, in addition to the fact that he was very strong-willed and very effective as a leader, is because there was a popular movement. It wasn't just Martin Luther King, but with Martin Luther King and John Lewis and a whole host of men and women, they worked in tandem. Popular movement enabled and triggered the President of the United States to enact the kinds of reforms that Lyndon Johnson was able to put forth. And we haven't had that in a while. That's what we really need in this country. Not great lawsuits, although we need those lawsuits, but a popular movement.
And that's actually an important point, too, because I think the Supreme Court has ruled twice in the last 8 years to essentially gut the Voting Rights Act. 2013, I think, earlier this year as well, right?
That's right. The Voting Rights Act, one of the great provisions of Lyndon Johnson's Voting Rights Act was that in certain jurisdictions, not all across the country, but in certain jurisdictions, including in Manhattan and Brooklyn and the Bronx, if there were going to be any changes in any part of the electoral system, whether it was changing the way we vote for mayor or moving a polling place, anything really big or anything really small, it had to be approved by the Department of Justice or a court. And that was true in most of the states of the South, and lots of other places in the country where there was discrimination against African Americans and Latinos, Native Americans, language minorities, and so on. And that's been gutted by the Supreme Court of the United States, enabling these states, Texas, Georgia, to pass laws that are so detrimental to people voting without now having to have any of their changes approved by the Department of Justice. If the Supreme Court of the United States hadn't gutted the Voting Rights Act, most of these laws would never have gone, would never have been passed and gone into effect. So it's really important that we have a president picking Supreme Court justices who will support the rights of the people of this country, and we see what's happened in the last administration, and it's going to take a while to rectify that, unfortunately.
I'm going to stop here for the moment and ask any of you if you have any questions, or folks on Zoom, if they have any questions they'd like to ask. Peter's coming around with a microphone for you.
After all the work that Stacey Abrams did in Georgia, huge amount of work, why is it in trouble now? Why is Fulton County, why is this happening? Is none of her work going to survive? And why are the bad guys winning?
That's a good question.
The bad guys are winning because they won. The reason they won is because as we know, every 10 years, we redraw district lines. And in 2010 and in 2020, the vote was such that Republicans did a lot better than Democrats did in state legislatures across the country. And as a result of that, they are in charge of, in many of these places, of writing the laws. Despite the fact that Stacey mobilized tremendous numbers of people to vote for her for governor, she didn't prevail. But not only that, that election was not one of the elections where you control a state legislature. That's what really needs to be done. And I hate to say it, but the progressives and Democrats failed in 2010 to put out a real mobilization in great numbers in order to capture state legislatures, and the same was true in 2020. Unfortunately, we focused too much on the presidency and not on state legislatures, and Republicans did very well 10 years ago and this time around, and they're going to continue to control state legislatures for the next decade. That's pretty bleak, but that's a fact. And the only way that's going to change is around the edges every 2 years, every 4 years in these elections, which means Stacey's work continues. You know, you fail a lot before you succeed, but you got to continue to work on it because we don't have a choice.
And actually, just as a piggyback to that, I wanted to ask you a bit, because we talked about social movements. She's a movement, it seems to be, unto herself, and has one of the things, and I know her, and I was talking to her about this very issue, that she went into areas of Georgia that Democrats didn't often go and had taken for granted, including black farmers in rural Georgia who were happy to see her and nobody ever visited them. But she created essentially a movement unto herself. So, and Jerry touched on this earlier, talk about sort of what Stacey did in the context of social political movements in our recent history. And, is the Sanders movement similar? Was Barack's movement similar? Like, what does it take to galvanize millions of people?
No, that's a great question. I mean, as gloomy as we can be about it, I mean, there's still opportunity to increase the turnout in a highly polarized politics that could push back against these things in Georgia and elsewhere. And Stacey Abrams has shown that if you're smart and informed and committed, you can work with other similarly minded people to push back against the erosion of democracy in the United States. And I think that's exciting that there is a movement on behalf of multiracial democracy, and we can all be part of it. And so I don't want to be overly pessimistic. I mean, she's a good example of a good role model for all of us in that sense. Social movements, right, they're not like political parties. They're more episodic. They rise up. People become committed to a cause. But very often, if they have just initial success, they can, that enthusiasm can dissipate. And and so we need to, be in it for the long haul, and to be committed. And we need to build institutional support for these efforts. And I think the right in this country, especially the moneyed class of right-wingers like the Koch brothers and others, for decades invested in trying to take over state legislatures and building state think tanks to put out propaganda and demonize minorities and liberal groups and so on. And they're very successful in taking back the state legislatures in a lot of places. And the left has to do the same thing. We have to be involved on the ground to build the institutional infrastructure to create and sustain whatever enthusiasm that arises out of a social movement like what Stacey Abrams has been able to create in Georgia.
Thank you. And I'd also add something that I do talk about often that that a lot of political folks you don't hear about as much on television is judicial elections, judges. It's one of the least discussed, often behind closed doors decisions or elections, if the judges are getting elected, that a part of our process. Very, very, I don't want to say secretive, but I guess maybe that's the best word I can use in the moment. And so when we think about the role that judges have played in all of these decisions across the country, and you look at, how right after the election, all of these Trump lawyers were going to courts to test the waters. And I would often say that this was not just about this election, it was laying the groundwork for future opportunities to take states, jurisdictions, campaigns to court. It's not just for that moment. They're in this for the long haul, and we must be also. But judges is something that we started to talk a little bit about when Trump was appointing all of these federal judges and did so at a record rate. And then folks were like, oh, wait a minute, we need to actually pay attention to this. And you see why. Any other questions from the audience? I do have one on from Zoom that I want to get to. There is a Zoom question related to what we discussed before, and that is, if we don't have voter ID, where if you're, I'll say it verbatim. As I understand you're against voter ID because some states have laws requiring birth certificate. Wouldn't it be more helpful, more positive, more forward-moving to advocate a federal issuing of voter ID cards and put your energy into influencing all states to allow federal ID for voting? To continue trying to place blame on Republicans for everything you don't agree with doesn't move our country into a safer and more fair union. So it goes back to the question I asked earlier. There is pushback on this issue of voter ID or showing your ID when you go to vote. Does that solve the problem?
I think the question answers itself, really. Yes, it would be much better to have a federal ID rather than waste all these resources going to court and trying to stop unfair state IDs. If we had one federal ID, that would end the story, and we could move on.
Okay, yes, you have a question there. There's a microphone.
I have a question based on that. Are the qualifications for voting in state elections uniformly the same throughout the country? In age,
No, every state has its own set of election laws. When we founded this republic 230 some odd years ago, one of the thrusts of the Constitutional Convention was to maintain the authority of the states in a variety of subjects, including elections. So we have 50 states, we have 50 different set of election laws.
so a federal ID for voting really wouldn't work in state elections.
Well, no, it could be, because even though the Constitution, it's that state-driven system that I just mentioned is embedded in the Constitution. States shall regulate their own elections. There's a phrase that goes after it, and I'm paraphrasing, that Congress can override that. Congress can enact laws, and we've done so, like the voting rights law, like HAVA, like motor voter. They've done so, Congress has done so from time to time, that overrides states' regulation of federal elections. Now, mind you, Congress can only pass laws relating to federal elections. So if a state, and states generally speaking, will conduct their state and local elections in the same way as they conduct their federal elections, for the most part. So if Congress passes one of the bills, one of the voting rights bills that's before it now, I think we can assume for the most part that states will conduct its state elections similarly as they do the congressional elections and the presidential elections. But now that I've said that, I worry if that's the case. Take Stacey Abrams and the Georgia example. If Congress passed a law today that made it much easier for people to vote in federal elections, etc., the Georgia state legislature can still, if it wishes, to have a different set of rules for state elections in order to prevent, in this case, in order to prevent Stacey Abrams from winning. Would people get nuts about that and try to stop it? Probably. But if the Republican legislature in Georgia were intent on doing that, even in the face of a new federal law, they can do it because it's a state election.
We have time for one more quick question. Yes, there's a microphone coming, please.
One of the things that's striking to me about voter suppression is the silence of moderate Republicans. Do you think that they're going to start to speak out as this becomes a bigger and bigger issue?
I think we have some moderate Republicans speaking out. What's her name from New Jersey? Christy Todd Whitman. And
Former governor. Yeah.
former governor of New Jersey, and another person whose name I can't remember wrote an op-ed about moderate Republicans or never Trumpers Republicans. I don't know what a moderate Republican is these days, but people who are not tied to Trump, who are what we might characterize as sensible Republicans, whether you agree with them or not on specific matters, but sensible Republicans. They're trying to build a movement within the Republican Party to kind of retake it. So they're trying. I don't know that they'll succeed, but they're trying, or at least some people are trying.
Maybe what I'll do is I have a good friend who's a Republican. We're on TV a lot together, Susan Del Percio, who's a contributor at MSNBC. Maybe I can invite her and we can have a conversation about where Republicans are in this country and what she and others might be doing to address these issues.
Yeah, and she's very good.
And she's very good and a dear friend. So maybe that'll be our next conversation. Gentlemen, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit for our last question and point. There is a mayoral debate for the general election tonight. What do you predict is going to happen tonight, either, both of you? What, are we going to see fireworks? We're going to be heavy on policy? What do you think?
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. I haven't been following New York City politics.
It was kind of a lull after a
I
while. Like
thought-
after the primary, it kind of just went.
Yeah, don't you think Adams has got it wrapped up, I think?
The numbers work in his favor. I'll say that in my nonpartisan way. The numbers work.
It's kind of a relief to not have such a intense election for a change.
I think Eric Adams will play it cool and just speak about what his vision is for New York and let Curtis Lewa
Be Curtis Lewa.
be Curtis Lewa. Thank you.
Yep, that's all right, gentlemen. I'm really glad that you could join us today. Thank you so
Thank
very
you.
much, and
Thank
thank
you
you all for
very
coming.
much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.